Okay, folks, this next story I have for you is about Jim Board. I met Jim in November 1978 when I was assigned to Headquarters Air Training Command Flight Safety down at Randolph. I'd been the Chief of Safety Advance, and Jerry Hodson, who was in charge of flight safety at that time, brought me down to work with him at Randolph. At any rate, Jim was a civilian at the time, assigned to our division, and it was his responsibility to track statistics. And if you wanted to know anything about a T 38 accident, you went to Jim. And he knew it for the most part from memory, but then he'd go back and pull the accident brief and then give you the information you were seeking. At any rate, I just loved going back on occasion and sitting and talking to Jim, have a cup of coffee, and just listen to him. He was quite an interesting fellow. Turns out he'd flown P 51s in World War II. At any rate, one day I walked in the office and Jim was sitting there and kind of had his head buried in his hands, was just shaking his head. And he looked up and he says, "Hey, boss," he says, "I have to take a couple hours off." He says, "I'll check in the morning." And he got up and walked out. He had a wife that he was dealing with at the time that she was really a challenge to him. So we didn't think too much of it one way or the other. We said, "Okay, Jim, we got you covered," and off he went. Well, the next morning he walks in with his cigarette. Back in those days, the guys could smoke in the office, and he had his cigarette. He walked over and got a cup of coffee and sat down, and we kind of were looking at him. And he looked up and he says, "I got the dumbest son you could ever want to have if you'd want to have a dumb son." Okay, there must be a story there. He says, "This kid," he says, "I don't know." He says, "This kid drives into this bank on Pat Booker Road there, just off base, drives up to the teller's window and hands her a note. And the note said, 'I need $250 in cash, and I need it right away. I have a gun.'" And he puts it in that tube and fires it into the bank. Well, as it turns out, his kid had car payments due, and he was 2 months behind, and the car payments were $125 each, so he needed just enough money to cover the car payments until he got back on his feet. Okay, fine. So he sends this thing in, and he's sitting there, and he's sitting there. And after a while, he says, "Look," he says, "if you don't mind, I'm kind of in a hurry." And apparently he sat there for 9 minutes before the cops showed up. Go, good God. And he sat there, he didn't see anything wrong with just sitting there waiting for the 250 to come back through the tube. Well, of course, the cops surrounded him, and because he said he had a gun, things weren't going to work out well for him. But I just look at Jim, and as I tell this story, I see him sitting there holding that cigarette, just shaking his head, wondering, what did I do wrong? Anyway, like I said, Jim was just magic with statistics and information about the T 38. And I leaned on him a great deal while I was there in ATC safety. And then later on, as I began to develop the stall ride for the T 38. And I'll tell you about that in another story later on as we continue on this journey. Good to see everybody here, and I'll tell you, it's so nice not to have to be reading one of Sam's stories with those glasses. I love the stories, but wish I could see better. Anyway, take care, guys.